It's certainly been an interesting year, but it's worth celebrating anyway. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2024, a year that promises to be even crazier than 2023. It hardly seems possible, but I've got good money on this year being, to use the technical term, completely bonkers. But we still have some business from 2023 left to attend to. I need to count down my favorite horror books and movies from 2023, and that's what we're doing this evening. To begin with some general thoughts, I have to say this was a weird year for horror. When I started writing out my lists and making my selections, I was struck by the fact that there was a ton of horror this year, and I liked a lot of it, but I wasn't really blown away by most of them. To put it another way, I had an overabundance of potential honorable mentions, but struggled a bit to find the ones that I'd make my official picks for best of the year. Be that as it may, I got it done and the lists are ready to go, so we're about to count down my 5 picks for best horror movies and 5 picks for best horror books of 2023. As is the case every year, the rules are that the title had to have a major release this year. So I'm not picking ones that I read or watched for the first time this year that might have come out a while ago, but I might include one if, for example, a film played the festival circuit toward the end of last year, but it got its major theatrical release this year. And of course, I didn't read or see everything that came out, so if I missed something, be sure to leave me a note down in the comments. It's too late to make it to this year's official list, but if they're good, I still want to check them out, so I want to hear about them. While you're leaving those comments, be sure to do all the other things that feed YouTube's algorithm. Like, share, subscribe, and so forth. And of relevance to all of you, I'll be putting links down in the What's It where you can find copies of these books and movies for yourselves. Assuming, of course, they're available for purchase as of this filming. But let's go ahead and get right to work, beginning with the best horror movies of 2023. There certainly were a lot of them, and though I liked most of them, I've said before, I'm not hard to please, but I am hard to blow away, and so I did struggle to pick my 5 favorites. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to present 4 top picks in no particular order, and then I'll share my number 1 pick at the very end of the list. We begin with one that rather surprised me, and that's Saw X, or Saw X. I went into this movie expecting another bloody Saw sequel, and I was okay with that. That sort of thing has its place, but it wouldn't necessarily have earned a spot on my best of the year list. Instead, though, while we still have plenty of Saw's trademark extreme and creative violence, we actually got a good movie, the likes of which the franchise hasn't given us in quite a while. Instead of just mindless violence, we get a relatively deep story about a man coming to terms with his terminal cancer. A story of dashed hopes, and a story, remarkably enough, in which John Kramer, of all people, seems a lot more like the hero than the villain. He's always been an interesting sort of character because, despite his villainous actions, the motivations behind his murders were always intellectual and the sort of thing that makes the audience struggle a bit with the morality of what he's up to. But in this case, his victims are such monstrous people, charlatans who sell fake cancer cures to the desperate and rob dying people of both their money and their dignity in the process. We find ourselves cheering Kramer on unreservedly as he gives them the kind of justice that only horror movies can dispense. If you want some moral ambiguity in your horror, you can struggle with the difference between justice and vengeance while you watch it, but I think most of us take it as more of just a cathartic experience. Either way, it was great to see Kramer taking the lead role in another Saw movie, and it certainly breathed a lot of new life into a franchise that, though I was still a fan, had honestly started to get a little bit stale. The next one we're going to talk about flew under the radar a little bit, and I honestly haven't heard many people talking about it. In fact, it almost didn't even make it onto this list, because it had flown under my radar as well. But I did make sure to cram in a few extra books and movies during this strange, timeless sort of week between Christmas and the New Year. A week in which pretty much all I've done was lie about, eating cheese and wondering what I've been doing with my life, and watching and reading some new horror. And amazingly, one of those last-minute watches made it right onto my list of best of the year. That movie is called The Offering. It's about a family who run a Jewish funeral parlor, and they end up facing an ancient demon when the body in which the entity was trapped finds its way into their home. At the same time, there's quite a bit of character drama because this all occurs at the same time as an estranged son returns to reconnect with his father and to ask a financial favor. Of course, this results in plenty of tension between the characters, particularly between the two brothers, even before the horror starts in earnest. And that's one of the things I really liked about it, because the characters aren't just cardboard stand-ins or disposable teenagers. We have a cast of well-fleshed out people, real people, and I honestly would have preferred even a little more of the human drama running in parallel to, or perhaps in advance of, the real horror. I also think it's refreshing that we're starting to see some more Jewish horror these days. Though I'm not Jewish myself, Judaism is a rich tradition, and I think it's great to see that some people are starting to explore some Jewish folklore. A friend of mine wrote an essay recently in which he admitted that one of his novels was turned down by a major publisher, he did not specify which one, explicitly because the novel dealt with Jewish folklore. He eventually placed it with a publisher that specializes in Jewish literature, but while that's good, it's also a real shame, because it seems to me that, with the exception of the distressingly large Hamas contingent within the creative community, audiences are clamoring for more high-quality Jewish horror. And The Offering treats us to a rich setting in the Hasidic funeral home, and plenty of Jewish folklore, including a demonic force that isn't just another Dybbuk. Not that there's anything wrong with a Dybbuk in a horror story from time to time, but it's nice to see something new. I could easily find a few things to criticize. As much as I loved the human drama, I think it could have been expanded upon. As much as I loved the monster, this demonic force, it was a bit hampered by too heavy a hand with the special effects in a couple of the scenes, and I think maybe it could have gone even deeper into its Kabbalistic lore. Perhaps a bit more subtlety with some of the scares, and maybe another 20 or 30 minutes of runtime could have made it all the way to my number one selection. But as it is, it was still an impressive showing. And though I won't spoil the ending, I will say it managed to stick the landing far better than most horror movies do. If you're looking for some films with which to compare it, imagine combining the Jewish folklore of The Vigil or The Possession with the setting and atmosphere of something like The Autopsy of Jane Doe, and I think you'll have a pretty good idea what you're in for. My next pick is going to be really controversial, but one of the things I like about the horror genre is its diversity in terms of format, tone, and theme. The movie I'm talking about is Nefarious, the story about a psychiatrist who's going to examine a death row inmate the day before his execution to sort of clear all the necessary paperwork and evaluate his mental state. But the inmate claims to not be an ordinary inmate, but rather a demon. And the resulting film consists almost entirely of the conversation between these two characters, sort of a battle of wits between the psychiatrist and the inmate slash possible demon. A lot of people hated this movie, and I think their criticisms mostly come down to 2 points, which in a certain way were actually positives for me. The first is, of course, that this film is not only explicitly religious, very, very Christian, but it's also quite conservative in its politics. And that's true. That criticism is true. It's definitely a film with a message, and a lot of people disagree with its message. That's fine too. This isn't a political channel, so I won't go into it too much, except to say there are points of its message I agree with, and there are points of its message I disagree with. But I don't hold movies up to a standard of reflecting my own religious or political views, at least not exactly. It's interesting to see my own views, but it's also interesting to see other people's views and the implications of both of them and how they play out in horror films. We need that diversity of thought, not only in our nonfiction, where it's relevant for political discussions and religious debates, but I think we need it in our fiction as well, because our fiction is where if our nonfiction is where we exercise our mind, our fiction is where we exercise our heart and soul. And I think that diversity of thought and perspective is important in both places so that we can examine how other people are thinking and how they would react in various different kinds of circumstances. And let's be honest here. Whatever your religious or political views are, I think it's pretty clear to most of us that most movies these days, when they do get political, tend to go in the other direction. They tend to be more liberal than conservative, and I think that's especially true in the horror genre. And there's nothing wrong with that either, but I thought it was rather refreshing to see a perspective we don't see in every other horror movie out there. The other criticism is that some people say it's not really a horror movie, but I think they're mistaken. I think it's perhaps more horror than most if you buy into its premise. And by that I don't necessarily mean you have to agree with it completely, but if you can at least suspend disbelief long enough to pick up what it's putting down, I do think it's a horror movie. It's not bloody, and it doesn't have any jump scares to speak of, but it focuses on a subtler intellectual kind of horror. To be fair to the critics though, the trailers did make it look more like a standard demon possession story, something more along the lines of The Exorcist. Whereas the movie itself, what we actually end up watching, is more akin to the Screwtape Letters than The Exorcist. So I understand people who felt lied to by the advertising, but again, I come back to finding it refreshing because it wasn't just the same as every other demon possession story. Perhaps they could have advertised it better, but I thought the movie itself was intriguing. In the same year that gave us sensationalistic films like The Pope's Exorcist, it was nice to get something that relied so heavily on the acting and conversation between just two characters. And I do think Sean Patrick Flannery's performance is one of a handful, along with Alyssa Sutherland in Evil Dead Rise, the two girls in Megan, and Caitlin Dever in No One Will Save You, that might be in the running for Best Horror Performance of the year. So yeah, it's easily my most controversial pick of the year, and it's certainly not for everyone, but in a year that seemed dominated by films that were good but not great, I thought it was refreshing to see one that stood out for doing something a bit different than most. Another movie in that same category of at least they weren't trying to do the same things as everyone else, of course, was Skinamarink, which I'm going to jump ahead a bit and admit was one of my honorable mentions for the year, and a similarly controversial pick for entirely different reasons. It's another one that dared to be different, which earns it big points in my book, but in that case, I just can't stand to watch that experimental of a movie for that long. Had it been a short, it might have made my list, but then no one probably would have noticed it because short films never seem to get much distribution. But before I get to the rest of the honorable mentions, I do have one more that's on my official list of picks for best of the year, and it's another fairly strange one, but more mainstream than some of my other picks, and that's Infinity Pool. It's arguably more sci-fi than real horror, but y'all know I'm pretty much always happy to claim anything I liked in the name of my favorite genre, the best genre in the world, and this is certainly no exception. It's hard to summarize it without giving way too much away, and like I said, it's certainly an odd one, but if you like a movie that's driven by equal parts of weirdness and great acting, I think you'll consider it a real winner. Any movie that makes you think is a winner in my book, and behind all the weirdness in Infinity Pool, there are some fascinating ideas. It hints at questions of consciousness and individuality, but where it really shines is in its exploration of what people do and what people become when all accountability for their actions is removed. And let's just say that coming at a time when fewer and fewer people seem willing to accept responsibility for their own actions, and indeed for their own lives, it serves as a timely and thoroughly entertaining reminder that this is a road we really oughtn't go down. And now, before I reveal my number one movie pick for 2023, I do have some honorable mentions. I'm putting these in no particular order, but these films represent films that didn't quite make it into my top 5, but nevertheless are highly rated and worthy of some attention. These are ones that maybe weren't my absolute favorites, but I certainly recommend them. The first of these I already mentioned was Skinamarink, for reasons that I've already mentioned. The next on this list is a more recent one, and that's Eli Roth's Thanksgiving. It's not quite unique enough to be an absolute favorite of mine, but it is a really fun slasher movie with a bit of mystery and an opening sequence taking place during a Black Friday riot that's really one for the history books. Harkening back to experimental films, or at least somewhat experimental films, No One Will Save You also gets an honorable mention. It's a kind of alien invasion story, but extremely localized, almost to the point of being a kind of home invasion story, except the invader in this case is an alien. But it gets big points for being super atmospheric and quite creepy. And like I said, it's also a kind of experimental sort of film because there's only one line of dialogue in the movie, but it still doesn't feel boring to watch. The actions all make enough sense, and the acting is strong enough to carry the story forward. So, going back a little bit, while Skinamarink gets perhaps even more credit for doing something even more ambitious and experimental, it also loses points for being so experimental and weird that I couldn't quite find anywhere to hang my hat while watching it. No One Will Save You manages to be different enough to still interest me, but has enough of that traditional narrative structure that I still understood what was going on at any given moment during the movie. Moving right along, I also quite liked The Last Voyage of the Demeter. Y'all know I'm a Dracula nerd, and I thought it was a damn good expansion upon the story of the ship on which Dracula traveled to his new home. It's a tiny little passage in the book, but it was interesting to see it come to life on screen with all the characters more fleshed out. I did think it needed to pull back on somewhat bad CGI effects a little bit and keep Dracula more in the shadows, where I think he's even more frightening. And the very ending of the film isn't even worth watching, and those things kept it from reaching the top of the list, but as long as you ignore the last couple minutes, it's still a pretty great movie. One honorable mention that's going to actually be a lot of people's favorite, I think, for this year is Talk to Me. I thought it was a great movie, so let's get that right out from right at the start. It is a great movie. It's a fairly standard Ouija board gone wrong kind of a story, but with just enough originality to make it entertaining, though perhaps not quite enough for it to really stand out as something entirely new. It's well acted, and of particular interest to me, especially since, thanks to a friend of mine, I now have one. The hand prop at the heart of the movie really is a great prop. In fact, even before the movie came out, the same friend that got me one and I were talking to each other about it, and we both said, I have no idea what this movie is going to be, but I need one of those hands. So it's got a great prop at the heart of it as well. So I guess we could say I really have no complaints, except to say that while I do think it's one of the better movies of the year, if perhaps not quite good enough to make it to my top 5, but that doesn't really mean much because there's a lot of movies out there, nevertheless, I think it's also perhaps one of the most overrated movies of the year because I just didn't get the amount of hype it generated. It's a great movie, but people talked about it like it was a life-changing kind of movie, and I didn't see it on quite that level. It didn't come across as that sort of once-in-a-generation film. It came across as maybe not top 5, but certainly top 10 of the year. The next honorable mention ought to be no surprise to anyone, and that's Evil Dead Rise. It's another one I thought was a great movie, and as I already mentioned, it featured one of the standout performances of the year. But the thing that keeps it from being one of my top 5 was honestly that it just didn't quite feel like an Evil Dead movie to me. It felt more like another kind of horror movie, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just not quite what I expected from the franchise and not quite what I was looking for. So another one that was great, but just didn't quite hit what I wanted from it. Another one for the list of honorable mentions that's sure to divide audiences is Renfield. Let's be perfectly honest. It's not a great movie. It's barely even a good movie. But it's a really fun movie. Nicolas Cage really stole the show as Dracula, and apparently this is the year for Dracula movies. And in Renfield, it's got some scenes of violence that are just plain fun to watch. Not a great movie by any means, but certainly one that I was glad to see with a large audience, with people hooting and laughing along with the over-the-top scenes of action and violence. That's the way to see it, and if you see it in that kind of context, I think you'll understand why it was an honorable mention for me. And then there's the Irish movie Unwelcome, whose release had been delayed a few times. It was on my most anticipated of the year for a couple years. But it finally came out, and though not a lot of people noticed it, it's certainly worth a watch. It's a fairly run-of-the-mill, but good folk horror tale. But the little monsters, once we finally get to see them, reminded me a lot of something Jim Henson might have done if he did horror movies, and I'm a big fan of that. Speaking of Henson-style monster puppets, another one I'm mentioning is a short film called Demon for Hire. It was directed by, not a close friend, but a friendly acquaintance of mine named Travis Heerman, who's actually currently fighting to recover after a very serious accident. It's not my place to go into it, but we got some really bad news a week or so ago. So I wanted to mention that because it's sort of relevant, but that's not the only reason I'm mentioning his short film. It's a fun little story about, as the title suggests, a demon for hire. But the demon is essentially a Muppet-like character, and that makes it just a blast to watch. It's got some interesting horror elements and some interesting comedy elements, and having this Muppet demon running around, it's the kind of thing that you don't expect a Muppet to be saying these things and doing these things, and it's just a blast to watch. And finally, my last of the honorable mentions for 2023 is When Evil Lurks, an Argentine take on a demon possession story. This apparently also seems like it was a year for Dracula and also a year for demon possession stories. In this case, not only does it put some new twists on the classic demon possession tale in a way that I think is really interesting, but it has a couple specific moments, a couple specific scenes that even manage to surprise me. And I'm one of those people who's seen so many horror movies, I can usually see every twist coming from a mile away. I'm not quite sure that I completely buy the film's backstory, the sort of world in which the story takes place. It's explained well enough, but it raised some questions for me that made it hard to suspend disbelief about certain elements. But the movie itself is a really good watch, and the plot, once the plot gets going, despite some backstory questions, the plot itself is also really strong. And that's all of the honorable mentions, so that brings us to my pick. My final pick for the #1 horror movie, the very best horror movie of 2023, which is, drumroll please, The Exorcist Believer. I'm kidding, don't throw stones. Y'all should know me better than to think that was going to be my choice. I had to do that. My real #1 pick, coming as probably no surprise to anyone who's been paying attention to which films I have and which films I have not mentioned so far, is Godzilla Minus One, which just proves that sometimes we shouldn't make our lists too early in the year, because this one came right at the very end of the year, and it made it all the way to the #1 spot immediately. Not only is it a visually impressive Godzilla movie, which honestly looks better than anything the Hollywood superhero studios are churning out, and on a tiny fraction of their budget, but it's also a deep and emotional human story about a failed kamikaze pilot struggling to come to terms with the end of the war. When I first saw it, I was going to joke that it was a sequel to Oppenheimer, for obvious reasons. And I also recommend Oppenheimer, by the way, even though I'm not listing it because it's not a horror movie. But honestly, that's barely even a joke. Both of those films deal explicitly with the aftermath of the war, and specifically of the bomb. They deal with a lot of similar issues from opposite sides of the war, and from almost opposite film genres, but they make a remarkable pairing if you're into double features. Even if you're not, you still need to see the new Godzilla movie if you haven't already. Not a whole lot of horror movies came out toward the end of this year, but Godzilla is easily the best of the ones I saw. However, don't turn off your YouTube yet. We still have plenty more to talk about, because I also need to count down my favorite horror books of 2023. Before we do that, let me take just a quick moment to sincerely thank you for watching this, and for watching all of my other videos, if in fact you have been watching them. It's been a crazy year, both individually and collectively. I think for the better and for the worse, but even when it comes to the better, it's also been sort of crazy and out of control. And I really do appreciate what time y'all spend in my little corner of the crazy house. I also hope you stick around in 2024, because I'm planning a lot of great things. The little gray cells are working overtime, and the cogs are turning, and I've been shaking off the mental cobwebs, and hopefully y'all will want to come along for the ride. But anyway, let's talk about some books. The same rules are going to apply here. The book needs to have been released in 2023, or at least to have had a major release in 2023. I make allowances for books that have maybe been out of print for a while and were re-released, that sort of thing, but basically it had to come out this year. And as I did with the movies, I will list positions 2 through 5 in no particular order, and then I'll reveal my favorite book of the year at the very end. I'm also adding one additional rule when it comes to the books. I'm disqualifying my own books. Obviously, these are my own favorites, but it wouldn't be right for me to list them here. So, yes, I recommend my books, Case Files of the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society Volume 1, that I co-wrote with Brian Bonner, and In the Woods, a Fiction Foundry anthology, which I edited and features a bunch of authors from my writers group. I can sort of compliment the other authors in this anthology, because at least I didn't write it, and I can compliment Brian's contributions to this book, because those weren't my contributions, but it's not right for me to review these. It's not right for me to list these on my best of the year. I hope you take an interest, and I hope you buy them anyway, but I am disqualifying my own books in the interest of propriety. Now, admittedly, I didn't read quite as many new books this year as I sometimes do. I read a lot of older books, and so I had a bit of a difficult time making my list, and I can almost guarantee that I've missed some great ones. But, at least of the ones I did read, here's what I came up with. First up, we have Episode 13 by Craig DeLuey. This is about people who are going to film the unlucky 13th episode of their ghost hunting show at a haunted house, as you do. But of course they find themselves facing some real hauntings. Because I've been working with the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society, reminder, I have a bit of a soft spot for that kind of a story. Even before taking that job, I found it to be an intriguing plot for a horror story. Of course, saying I like that kind of story also means there's probably a lot of that kind of story out there. And indeed there is. The idea of paranormal researchers getting caught up in something genuinely paranormal has become almost something of a cliche in the horror genre. But one of the things I really liked about episode 13 is that the characters are believable as individuals, but perhaps even more importantly, the cast of characters is believable as a mix of paranormal skeptics and believers. The arguments they have amongst themselves in this book ring true to me, because they're the same kinds of arguments I deal with pretty much every day. And, importantly, the author doesn't really seem to have any skin in the game. Obviously, we know that within the fictional world, the paranormal is going to turn out to be real. It's a horror novel, that's almost a given. But the author seems to have gone to great effort to give the believers and the skeptics alike equal time in the spotlight and equal opportunities to make great arguments and to make fools of themselves. Everyone gets moments sort of on the side of being right and on the side of being wrong, and on the side of giving an interesting argument and on the side of having an argument undermined. Plot-wise, it may have not quite stuck the landing for me, but I almost don't even care because the journey itself was so enjoyable getting up to that point. Next up is a rather different kind of a haunted house story, and that's The Last Haunt by Max Booth III. This one I've talked about before. It's about the McCamey Manor, but by a fictionalized name. That's the place where supposedly people sign this huge legal waiver and then get legitimately tortured for several hours in order to win a prize that no one's ever seemed to be able to claim. It's a real place, and it's controversial for a lot of reasons, and some of those reasons are better than others, but suffice it to say, I'm not really a fan. And so I really loved reading this novel, or novella, it's pretty short, because it fictionalizes the story while keeping all of the important details intact, and then it finishes the whole thing off with a bit of a horror novel kind of an ending. It's a short read, and one I recommended for this Halloween, because it was about haunted houses, so it was good for the Halloween season. But because I like a book that isn't just a good story, but perhaps one that sort of blurs the line a bit between the fiction and the nonfiction and gives the reader something to really mull over and think about, even though it was one of my Halloween recommendations, it's also one of my favorites of the year. Incidentally, since I filmed my full review of this book while discussing my October reading, I've discovered some more news. In a letter fittingly dated October 31st itself, the Attorney General of Tennessee informed McCamey Manor's ownership that they were initiating an investigation into the attraction's business practices. And I think that's important, because a lot of the controversy over the place has to do with the fact that it's been difficult for a lot of people to separate fact from fiction about it. I'm not necessarily saying they should be charged with any crime, although I do think Max Booth's novel is a fair representation of what the attraction is, and if that assumption is correct, I think they could perhaps at least be held liable for certain offenses in civil court. But at the same time, while criminal charges may or may not be appropriate, I'm also saying that I think it's a good thing that somebody's going to shine the investigative light on the haunt and let the public know what's really going on there. A lot of the controversy has to do with the fact that what people claim to have experienced in this haunt is very different from the way that Russ McKamey, the owner, has portrayed it. So there's a lot of that controversy going on as well, and I think the investigation hopefully will finally put that to rest. In the meantime, until that investigation is finished, while we wait for the outcome of that investigation, which will probably take a very long time because the legal system moves slowly, at least we can enjoy a good book on the subject that I think presents it as accurately as anything else, except for the horror story part that comes toward the end. Next up, I've chosen A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. It's a kind of a gothic story about a woman who moves back home with her mother, only to discover, gradually, that things just seem wrong. At first they seem just a little bit off, and then they seem really wrong. This one has less real bite than a lot of the books I'm recommending, but if you're looking for something with a slightly softer touch, I've found T. Kingfisher is perhaps the author for you. It's what we might almost call a kind of cozy horror. But it also has a cast of characters you're going to love, it's well written, and this one even has some rather curious vultures hanging around, and I love all of those things in a novel. I don't think this is one that will scare people, even those who are far less jaded than me, but I do think most people will find it fun and enjoyable to read. My next pick is The Nightmare Man by J.H. Markert. It's a delightful, classical kind of horror story about serial killers and the supernatural. So we get some elements of police procedural and mystery along with paranormal horror. And honestly, that's the kind of stuff I love. But you have to give it a bit of a chance before you really get to why I loved it so much. The description sounded maybe a bit on the cheesy side, and some of the stuff toward the beginning of the book seemed a little forced and maybe just so. That's not to say it was bad by any means, but maybe just a little bit contrived. However, that's an unfair assessment of where this ends up, because as the story moves on, all that stuff gets explained and incorporated into a plot that is reminiscent of the kinds of classic horror stories we know and love, without being derivative and unoriginal. I read this one fairly early in the year, and it managed to stay on my list of favorites the whole time. It harkens back to the kind of horror I grew up reading, and frankly, I wish we saw more of this kind of horror these days. So that was 4 picks. That means I have 1 left, which I've selected as my favorite book of the year. But before I do that, just as I did with the movies, I've picked out a few honorable mentions. Similarly, in no particular order, let's go through those. The first of which is this new Literally Dead anthology of holiday short stories. It's called Literally Dead: Tales of Holiday Hauntings, edited by Gabby Triana. I read a previous anthology in this Literally Dead series dealing with Halloween stories a few months ago, and I read this new one just a few weeks ago for the holiday season, and I loved it as well. I particularly liked a few stories in here that, like I mentioned with The Nightmare Man, felt rather classical. The holiday season, in particular, is the perfect time for ghost stories, and even though these stories are new, some of them nevertheless felt quite nostalgic. They felt classical. They felt like the kinds of ghost stories I grew up reading. And I love that kind of thing. There are a few that are a bit more modern, and those are good too. There's a couple in here that didn't do it for me, but overall, a wonderful anthology, particularly around the holiday season. Next is an odd little book called Research Randy and the Case of Grandma's Half-Eaten Pie of Despair by Tom Lucas. It reads, honestly, just like an old Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew style of children's or young adult mystery. But instead of the kind of family-friendly sleuthing in those books, this one deals with our youthful detective facing off against Lovecraftian horrors, and is written in a metafictional style in which the author himself becomes a character. That latter point is something I usually hate, but it's done so perfectly here that I found it to be a delightful read. Our next honorable mention is The Spite House by Johnny Compton. This is another haunted house kind of a book. I guess in the case of movies, this was the year for demon possessions and Draculas. In the case of books, it's the year for haunted houses. In this case, it's about a family on the run from something. We don't quite know what they're on the run from at the beginning of the story. And they take a deal, sort of out of necessity, to live in and study a supposedly haunted house that turns out to be all too real. This is another one that took a little bit of time for me to get into, but once it really got to the heart of the story, I started to love it. Perhaps the ending isn't perfect either, but aside from a few criticisms about the very beginning and the very end, I thought it was a great haunted house story that's familiar enough that we all kind of understand the rules and the tropes, but just original enough to keep us guessing. And our final honorable mention is Don't Fear the Reaper by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a sequel to My Heart is a Chainsaw, which was one of my best of the year picks in, I don't think it was last year, I think it was 2021. Regardless, that book was brilliant, and I couldn't wait to spend some more time with those characters, Jade in particular. I don't think the sequel quite lived up to its predecessor, but that's hardly a criticism because it's still a great book and left me wanting to read the next one in the series just as much as I wanted to read this one. I don't want to say too much by way of review because talking about the sequel could spoil too much of the ending of the first one, so I'll kind of leave it there, but I recommend reading both of them. Just make sure you read them in order. Start with My Heart is a Chainsaw, which was the first book, and I think slightly better, but then don't neglect Don't Fear the Reaper. It's the second book and still quite good. And that brings us to my pick for Best Horror Book of the Year for 2023. And this is going to perhaps be a bit of a controversial choice because I've actually chosen a non-fiction book instead of a horror novel. But my favorite book this year was The First Ghosts by Irving Finkel of the British Museum. This is a book that takes us through the history of ancient Mesopotamian ghost stories. I'm a nerd for ghost stories and for history, so this one was right up my alley. And I honestly don't want to belabor the point too much here because I made an entire video talking about just the sort of thing that this book talks about, along with mentioning it in a couple of other videos in which I've been recommending books this year. But suffice it to say that if you're interested in thinking about ghosts instead of just reading them in horror stories, this should be on your required reading list. And so there we have it, my top 5 each for horror books and horror movies in 2023, along with several honorable mentions. Like I said, this wasn't my best year for checking out new stuff, nor do I honestly think it was the best year for people producing new stuff, but we still found a bunch of winners. And I don't know about the rest of you, but as for me, I can't wait to see what new horrors we encounter in 2024. It's a leap year, so we've even got an extra day on which to scare ourselves silly. Do be sure to stick around as I continue exploring the genre here on this channel. Follow my publishing house at polymathpress.com, where you can also get copies of my books. Have a happy new year, and most importantly of all, take care and stay scared. Cheers.